Well, if you're just joining us, let me tell you what we're up to as a church. Actually about 10 weeks ago, we started this, just reading through the Bible together from one cover to the other. We think it's going to take us a year and a half or more, but we've gotten started. We've gone through the book of Genesis. We've been spending time in the book of Exodus, and we're going to wrap that up today. We're going to spend some time looking at the last chapters of the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 25 to the end of that book. One of our aims has been to just encourage each of us to be reading along. And so, especially as we're getting into a new year here, and maybe you're starting to already think about New Year's resolutions or things you aspire to in the year 2014, one of the things I just encourage is that you consider reading the Bible. And so as a church, the idea is this, that we're all going to be reading the Bible on our own, reading through Genesis and then Exodus, and by the way, next is going to come Leviticus. And then when we gather together on Sundays like this, we're going to just kind of summarize and see the big picture of what it is we've been reading. And so today, Exodus 25 through 40. Let me just set it up this way. The book of Exodus is really God leading his people out of Egypt and into his presence. And so God's people, the Israelites, were slaves in Egypt. They were bitterly oppressed with toil and heavy labor. And they cried out to God, and God heard their cry. And he answered. He sent a man named Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go." There were all these signs and wonders that God carried out in Egypt, and then he led his people out from there. They passed through the Red Sea with a wall of water on the right and left, with the armies of Egypt chasing them, and they saw the waters crash down over their enemies, and they were finally free, and they knew it, and they celebrated there on the beach. They were free people. God then led them to Mount Sinai, where he spoke to them, and he talked about the kind of relationship that he wants to have with his people. And we talked about how, as you read the book of Exodus, God lets us know he wants to have the most intimate, personal relationship. In fact, the whole thing is set up like a marriage, where God's a husband to his people. And that's kind of where we've left off. One of the ideas in marriage is that now, of course, if you're married, you're going to be together. And so the next question is really about the presence of God. And these chapters that we're going to read today, chapters 25 through 40, and we won't read them all, just portions of them. As we look through them, they're really about how God is present with his people. And he commands Moses and the Israelites to build this sanctuary, this temple, this tabernacle out in the wilderness. And the idea is that God is going to be present with his people. So if you're there with me in Exodus chapter 25, I want to read with you, just to get us started, the first 9 verses. And I'll just remind you that as we have our Bibles open, that this is God's word to us today. Chapter 25, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You're to receive the offering for me from each man whose heart prompts him to give. These are the offerings you are to receive from them: gold, silver and bronze, blue, purple and scarlet yarn, and fine linen, goat hair, ram skins dyed red, and hides of sea cows, acacia wood, olive oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil and for the fragrant incense, and onyx stones and other gems to be mounted on the ephod and breastpiece. Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." Let me just draw your attention now to verse 8 and then verse 9. Verse 8, God says, "Then, after they have all these offerings received, have them make a sanctuary or holy place for me." And I would expect the verse to say, "And I will dwell in it," since they're going to build this structure, but that's not what the verse says. It says, "And I will dwell among them." So this whole idea of this sanctuary is that God is going to dwell among his people. In fact, one of the things we celebrate at Christmas is this idea of Emmanuel, God with us. And one of the things we're going to see is that this sanctuary, this tabernacle, is a picture pointing us forward to Jesus, this idea that God is going to dwell among his people and dwell with us, God with us. Verse 9 says this, "Make this tabernacle and all its furnishings exactly like the pattern I will show you." And I'd submit to you that what we're about to read it reads like a blueprint. In fact, if you've ever tried to read the end of the book of Exodus, you'll realize, it's like reading the phone book, an instruction manual. It is so boring. And I say that as a pastor. This is a boring part of the Bible in some regards. I mean, and it's because it's like reading an instruction manual. That's what God gives here. And let me just orient you to what we're going to find as we read forward, beginning in chapter 25. From chapter 25, maybe just kind of start paging forward, all the way through chapter 31. God is speaking to Moses, and he's basically giving him instructions, like an instruction manual, about what they're supposed to build. All the specifications, exactly what it's supposed to look like, how big, how long each piece of furniture is, what materials are supposed to be used. It's like a blueprint. In chapter 32, 33, and 34, there's this break, an interruption, if you will. We'll come back and talk about that interruption. But beginning in chapter 35, you get to read this instruction manual over again. If you weren't bored the first time, this is your opportunity to get really bored by reading it again, because what you find here, beginning in chapter 35, then chapter 36, 37, 38, 39, and 40, basically it's a repetition of what you read beginning in chapter 25, only it says the Israelites built it according to the specifications. So you get to read all the specifications again, and if you took the time to compare, you'll see that they built exactly what the blueprint said that they were supposed to build. And so let's just talk a little bit about this sanctuary and this blueprint that gets specified to Moses up on the mountain from God. God says, okay, you're going to build this exactly the way I tell you, according to the pattern I give you. And there's a reason for that, is because God wants them to see something, a picture, if you will. And we don't have time to just read through everything, and it wouldn't be good reading if we did. You can do that on your own. But I want to just kind of give you an overview. So beginning in verse 10, there's some instructions about the furnishings that are supposed to go in this tabernacle. And the very first piece of furniture that's specified here is something called an ark. And basically, it's just this chest. It was made out of acacia wood, about 3 feet by 2 feet. And it was overlaid in gold. Just, you can kind of picture an empty box. That's the very first piece of furniture, the ark. The second piece of furniture, it starts in verse 17, is this cover that goes on that box. It's called an atonement cover. It was also made out of acacia wood. It was also overlaid in gold. And what was specified is that all in one piece, kind of protruding out from that cover, there were to be these 2 cherubs or angels that had their wings outstretched, facing each other. And the idea was that on this piece of furniture, right above the atonement cover, between the outstretched wings of angels, the idea was this, that God himself, the great I Am, was going to dwell in inexpressible form and light. I mean, that was the place. Okay, so that's the ark. And I just want to point out that it was overlaid completely in gold. If you continue reading forward, beginning in verse 23, there are 3 other pieces of furniture which you find are supposed to be in the sanctuary. There's a table, and it's just basically a table. It's also overlaid in gold. And basically what would happen is on this table there would be these 12 loaves of bread that would always be set there every single week. There was also to be a lampstand. Again, this lampstand was supposed to be made completely of gold. This lampstand had lights, candles at the top that were always to be lit. And so there was always light in the presence of the sanctuary. And then there was a golden incense altar, also totally made out of gold, upon which there would be this incense that would always be rising up. And what would happen is that all 4 pieces of furniture, the ark with its atonement cover, the lampstand, the table, and the golden incense altar would all be placed in this tabernacle, this kind of structure, tent-like place, this sanctuary. And I just want to point out now, we don't have time to talk about what all these pieces of furniture were all about. I just want to point out that they were all made out of gold, and that was, if you walked into this tabernacle, what you'd find there. Does that make sense so far? Okay, next, around this tabernacle there was a courtyard. And in the courtyard there were a couple pieces of furniture. The very first one you find in chapter 27, verse 1. There was an altar for burnt offering, and if you read about this altar, it was made out of bronze. There was a second piece of furniture that you'd find in the courtyard. It was also made out of bronze. You can read about it in chapter 30. It was a big bronze basin that was used for washing. So there was this big altar and there was this big basin. They were both made out of bronze. And these pieces of furniture were put in the courtyard which surrounded the tabernacle. Can you kind of see that now? So you've got the gold pieces of furniture inside the tabernacle. You've got these bronze pieces of furniture that were outside the tabernacle. And we don't have time to talk about what each of these were all about now, but simply to say that's what the layout was like as you kind of read your way through. I want to spend some time also just talking about the tabernacle itself. Israel was in the desert. They were wandering there. They went from place to place. They were living as nomads. And if you read about how they lived, they basically lived in tents. So it was easy for them to kind of pitch camp and then take up and move to another place. They were a very portable lifestyle. Probably the most solid structure that Israel had was this tabernacle. And it was made out of wood, but it also needed to be portable. And so you can actually kind of read about how it was built in chapter 26. I'll just give you the outlines now. It needed to be portable so they could kind of pick up and move it. And what they did is they actually made it out of boards, long boards. And those long boards had a kind of clasp in it with a pole that would go through it, kind of hold them all in place. And then at the top and the bottom of each of these boards, there were I guess I describe them as teeth that came up, both on the top and on the bottom. And as the boards came together, there were these silver bases or clasps that would fit over the teeth and hold the boards together. Does that make sense? You can kind of see how those silver clasps went over the teeth and held the boards together. And now, hopefully, we'll just kind of step back and get a big picture. You know that the Winter Olympics are coming up, right? And undoubtedly, you know that if you win, you get a medal. If you do well, you get a bronze medal, third place. But that's not the best, right? You can do better than that and get a silver medal. Or if you do the best, what color medal do you get? Gold, right? And so gold is the most precious, silver kind of second. I mean, this is to our human understanding. And I would say, if you kind of paid attention to what I've said, it's as though even God, in not a subtle way, wants to tell us something about his presence and what he means to his people. Because the closer you get to him, the more precious the metal. When you're out in the courtyard, all the furniture is bronze. The tabernacle itself, the structure is silver. But if you go inside where God is, in the sanctuary where his presence is, you now have gold. And I think it's not subtle. God, it's like he wants to show us a picture. The most precious thing is his presence. The thing we should desire the most, the most precious, our greatest treasure, is him. Does that make sense? It's like this picture, bronze, silver, gold. There's something else I want you to see as we talk about this tabernacle. I mean, so many things we could say about it, but I just want you to see this. Will you look with me at chapter 25? There are some verses here, and if you were to just read this story on your own, you might not pick up on this right away, but I think, in fact, the writer of this passage, he wants it to be obvious, so I want to point it out to you so you'll see it now, and then you won't not be able to see it again as you're reading it on your own. Chapter 25, verse 1, has these words, "The Lord said to Moses." If you were reading this on your own, probably just skip over it, right? But there's something here. The Lord said to Moses. So God speaks. And what's interesting, if you read through this blueprint, there's actually a number of times where that exact phrase gets repeated. And I want to just pay attention to it. You'd have to read all the way to chapter 30 to find the second time it gets repeated. I want you to look at chapter 30, verse 11. All right, if you're with me, chapter 30, verse 11, here's how that verse goes. "Then the Lord said to Moses." That's the second time. I'm just going to keep my fingers up here so we pay attention. We're going to count these off where God speaks. Okay, verse 17 of chapter 30 is going to be the next time we find these words. Verse 17, "Then the Lord said to Moses." Okay, that's 3. Okay, verse 22 is the next time of this chapter. Chapter 30, verse 22. "Then the Lord said to Moses." Okay, we're to 4. The next time is verse 34 of chapter 30. "Then the Lord said to Moses." You see that? That's 5. Chapter 31, verse 1 is the next time. Then the Lord said to Moses. That's 6. And then finally, we find it in verse 12 of chapter 31. Then the Lord said to Moses, which is now how many? 7. Okay, and as God's given the instructions for the tabernacle, he speaks 7 times. Now, we've been going through the Bible from the very first page. Do you remember another time when in 7 epics God speaks? When is that? At creation, right? How many days of creation were there? There were 7. And what's the premier feature of creation? Then God said, let there be light. And there was light. Then God said, let the waters above be separated from the waters below. And they were, right? God speaks and things are created. There are 7 days. Now, probably you remember this. There were 6 days on which God created, right? And then what did he do on the 7th? He rested. He said, this is now a Sabbath. He actually made it a pattern for us. 6 days you're going to work. The 7th day you're going to rest, right? Now, if you're with me, chapter 31, verse 12, which is the 7th time God speaks. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. So do you see that? 7 times God speaks. The 7th time he speaks, what's it about? Sabbaths. So you're to create something, but the 7th time God speaks, rest. And I don't think God's trying to be subtle here either. It's supposed to be obvious. As the Israelites build this tabernacle, it's supposed to be creation all over again. And if you remember when we talked about creation, kind of one of the premier features of creation, God made man in his own image, right? Male and female created, but we were in his own image. And you remember he built this garden, this paradise, and Adam and Eve worked that garden and took care of it. And one of the premier features of that garden was that human beings were in the presence of God, right? God walked in the garden in the cool of the day. Human beings who were created to have a relationship with God. God was with them. There was peace. There was harmony between us and God. And it's as though God now shows up to these Israelites and says, okay, I have a plan. This is my plan. I am going to establish a new beacon of creation, and I am going to be with you again. Does that make sense? And there's so many things we could say about this. Let me say this. Okay, one more thing. Okay, the way this tabernacle was oriented, there was this big gate. You can see it there around the courtyard. There was this large fence. There was a gate. It always faced east. You would always approach from the east. And you remember at the end of the creation story when Adam and Eve, they eat of the fruit they're not supposed to eat. God says on the day you eat of it, you're surely going to die. But Adam and Eve didn't die. But do you remember, could they stay in the garden? No, right? God cast them out of the garden, out of his presence. And then you remember what he did to make sure they wouldn't get back in the garden? He placed angels there, these mighty cherubs, to guard the way back to the Garden of Eden. So Adam and Eve were kicked out. They're separated away from God, right? God's our source of life. If we get separated from our source of life, what's going to happen to us? We're going to die. So the seeds of death are now at work in us. And this is a problem we can't do anything about. We can't claw our way back to God. There's nothing we can do because we've sinned and we're now cast out of the presence of God. And what we couldn't do for ourselves, God now, he shows up and he's basically saying, I am going to do this. I am going to establish my presence among you. And 2 interesting things. One, the way to God, you would come from the east, right? And the very first thing you'd see as you walked into the gate of the courtyard, what is the very first piece of furniture you'd see? A big altar. One of the things God wanted to communicate is that if you're going to come into the presence of God, there must be a sacrifice for sin. By the way, all this just points forward to Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. There has to be a sacrifice for sin. If we're not going to die, God said the day you eat of the fruit, you're surely going to die. Something else needs to die in our place. And so this whole picture is a picture of what's going to happen to Jesus on the cross because he's the sacrifice that finally pays for sin once for all. And you remember what happened when Jesus was dying on the cross? Okay, I want you to see this. Right in front of that ark where God was above those outstretched wings of angels, there was a curtain there, a veil. And you can actually read about it if you read through these chapters. Kind of woven into that veil was a picture of mighty cherub angels. You remember God on the east side of the garden, what he placed there? angels guarding the way back to the presence of God. And if you were to walk into that sanctuary, before you could enter into the most holy place where God was, there would be these mighty angel warriors kind of woven into the fabric. And you remember when Jesus died on the cross, what happened? The veil of the temple, right, was torn in two from top to bottom. Not from bottom to top, from top to bottom. God is the one who through Jesus Christ paves the way so that his presence can go out from there and finally be among his people. See, this is all about God's presence. Does that make sense? Okay, hold that thought. I told you that there's an interruption in chapters 32 through 34. And I want to spend some time talking about that interruption because I believe this interruption that you find there, it's super important. And it's all about the presence of God as well. So will you look with me just at the beginning of chapter 32? So Moses up on the mountain, he's receiving these instructions from God. Here's this tabernacle you're going to build so God can reestablish his presence with his people. And now we read this beginning in chapter 32. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, by the way, he was up there for like 40 days. So they're getting nervous, anxious. Where is he? Where is he? They gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." Aaron answered them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." So the next day the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Talk about an interruption. Okay, so God's up on the mountain talking to Moses about how he's going to dwell among his people. And you just have to kind of picture this, right? These Israelites, they had walked through the Red Sea with walls of water on the right and left. They had seen the Egyptian army drown behind them. They were now free. They had been brought to the base of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai had filled with smoke, and there was this pillar of fire. And out of that smoke and fire, they heard the audible voice of God himself speaking to them. I mean, you'd agree with me, right, that if our worship service was kind of like that this morning? I mean, imagine right now, like fire, smoke, and all of a sudden you're not hearing my voice, but God is like, "Hello." Like, can you imagine walking out into the parking lot and building a golden calf? So, I mean, you got to kind of scratch your head, like, what is going on? I mean, seriously. There's a way in which automatically we're like, boy, what was wrong with these people? But actually, I'd like to suggest that before we judge them too much, we should understand their motives. And let me suggest to you that they were really motivated around this whole concept of the presence of God. There are some people, as they've read this, that they think to themselves, well, they've now turned away from the great I am, Yahweh, and they've decided, let's follow the Egyptian gods and build a calf and worship that. But I'd suggest to you that's probably not, it's not as though they've turned away from the Lord. In fact, I would say that it all has to do with how they can make God, the Lord, Yahweh, present to them. Right? Moses has been up on the mountain. They're wondering, well, what's going on? Is he gone? Is he still here? I mean, they feel alone. They're worried. They're anxious. And so they build this calf. Look with me at verse 5. When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord," capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, which I've told you before, always stands for Yahweh, the great I am. They're not saying, let's now serve other gods. They've built this calf, and through this calf, they intend to make Yahweh, the great I am, present to them and serve him. Does that make sense? Like somehow they've wanted to make God present to them, tangible, so that he's with them again. That's their heart. That's their motivation. Moses is gone. They don't know what's happened, and they're scared out in the desert. They want to feel the presence of God. This is how they go about it. And maybe you could put it this way. I mean, they were kind of doing what works out of their cultural background. Like God's brought them up out of Egypt, and they're physically out of Egypt, but maybe Egypt is still somewhere in them. And so they're thinking, according to their understanding, what they'd seen happen when they were in Egypt, how to make the gods present. Before I say anything, let's try this. So I have a thing here. Could have been anything. I just grabbed a Kleenex box. But I want you to just think about the nature of things. So this particular thing, I think you'll see it has edges. It has boundaries. It takes up a defined piece of space, as all things do. I mean, you can see where it is. You can touch it. You can feel it. I think you can see that I'm able to manipulate it and move this thing from place to place as though, it's in my control, and I can now kind of manipulate this thing. It's tangible. I feel it. I know it. And what I'll say is this. I think there was always a temptation for all of God's people, both now and then, to try to think of God as though it's something tangible that we can wrap our minds around, that has edges and boundaries and we can define. And I would suggest to you that what the Israelites were doing is they were trying to make God in some way or another real by making him a thing. Okay, maybe that's my first attempt at this. Let's try this maybe another way. They built a calf. And you'll remember this as we talked about Egypt, that some of their gods were like Hathor, the cow god. And so as they thought about the powers of the world, there were these images or icons, not that golden calf was God, but somehow represented God, that they could kind of hold in their hands and they wanted to make God present. What we'll find here is that God was not too happy with them. I mean, if you continue reading forward, I guess the best way you can say it is God's really ticked. This is not what you're to do with God. In fact, his anger burns against them. He says to Moses, I'm not going to go with them. I mean, you go on your own up to the land I told you about, but I'm not going to go with you anymore. And Moses he pleads with God, and finally God agrees. And I would say it's all about God's presence. God does not want us to think of him in that way. So, how should we think about God? The fact that he's here with us. What is he like? I think some of the Psalms maybe did a good job of trying to say, what is this God? Who is he like? Psalm 24 starts this way. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, which is really a strong statement in his day, right? Egypt, they saw the sun as a god. They saw the seas as a god. They saw the crops. There was a god for the crops. Like everything had all the powers they saw at work in the world that they thought were gods. And God's like, no. Everything in this world is mine. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. That psalm, it ends with these words. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O you gates. Lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is he, this King of glory? The Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory. What are these heads of the gates? When we read this, what is it talking about? Let me show you a picture. This picture is of a temple in Egypt. It's a temple of the god Horus. And I want you to just see one of the features of this temple of Horus was a big gate. And to give you some perspective, can you see the people there at the bottom? Can you imagine walking into this gate like you're entering into the temple of this god Horus, who is the falcon-faced god of Egypt, and you're looking up and, whoa, look at this gate. What kind of god is Horus? Who is he? I mean, it's meant to what a big, powerful, mighty God. Are these gates tall enough for the Lord? Lift up your heads, O you gates. Be lifted up, so that the Lord Almighty may come in. Who is the Lord Almighty, this King of glory? The Lord Almighty is his name. Be lifted up, O you heads. The idea is, what if we just lifted it up a little more? Would that be tall enough for God? No, I mean, he's the Lord Almighty, the King of glory. The idea is like there's no temple with gates large enough to fit him in. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. And God, as he presented himself to his people, he didn't want them to think of some small object. He was the creator of heaven and earth. In creation, one of the first things God did, this is just a way of starting to think about it. He said, "Let there be light." The King of glory said, "Let there be light." First of all, let's just talk about that word glory. Who is this King of glory? In Hebrew, the word glory, actually the word is kavod. It means heavy or weighty. I think in English, probably the best way, glory probably doesn't mean a lot to us. Like you're talking with somebody and they say something profound and you're like, whoa, that's heavy, right? Some of you are like, heavy, dude. Like when something's glorious, it's profound, it's weighty, it's meaty. And one of the ideas is that this entire earth is just stamped with the glory or weightiness or profundity of God, so that no matter where you look, there's something profound there. God said in the beginning, "Let there be light." And this is the season of lights, right? The tree is lit, the candle's lit. I spent all of Friday putting exterior illumination on my house like the Griswolds. Not that bad, but I was out there with the kids and did a couple things, right? And it's a season of lights. And have you ever stopped to think about light? It is so profound. I don't know if you know this, but there's just a tiny fragment, like lights are actually these waves. And of all the electromagnetic waves that are out there, light, the visible light we see, our eyes are tuned to just see a small portion of it. So if you go home today and you turn on the TV and you start watching football, like the pixels, the light is going to come from the TV. There'll be waves that travel and they meet our eye, and our eyes are fine-tuned to see those waves. But there are all other kinds of waves that are happening at the same time, like when you press your remote, right? There are these waves that get sent to the TV. You can't see them, but they're there. There are cell phone conversations. We're sitting here, we're not aware of it, but there are these waves of cell phone, millions of cell phone conversations just like passing by as we sit here. Radio stations, right? Those are also electromagnetic waves. Right now, all the FM and AM stations are just like traveling past us, and our eyes can't see those waves, but they're all there. Your wireless mouse on your computer, right, with Bluetooth is using those waves. The Wi-Fi in your house. By the way, we human beings did not create these waves. Our scientists didn't make it. God, when he said, "Let there be light," it was there. And our scientists have figured this out and discovered how to manipulate those waves so we can send radio and TV stations and control our remotes and our garage door openers and our Bluetooth and our Wi-Fi. Whoa, that's heavy, dude. The King of glory is his name. Be lifted up, O you gates. I thought have you ever been outside and all of a sudden you saw just a landscape, or you saw something and it just like, whoa, this is profound. Just some pictures. Speaking of light, what a sight this is. The aurora borealis, the northern lights. Apparently, as the sun sends its light out, it has these rays that come off it that interact with the poles of our earth. And if you're far enough north at this time of the year, there's a spectacular light show. Can you imagine standing in this place and just, whoa. That's profound, this King of glory. Think about what he's made. Or just look at these pictures. What an artist God was as he put together this earth, the colors he used. The insects it takes to pollinate these flowers and the blue sky. And wow. It's wonderful. Standing on the edge of a huge canyon, just like, man, God, you're amazing. Look at what he's done. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. In the most obscure places, there's just this tremendous art and beauty wherever you go. Who could imagine that you go down into the depths of the ocean where no human being goes and you find paintings like this, creatures that are so ornate and put together. Whoa, that's heavy. It's profound. Who is this king? The King of glory. Lift up your heads, O you gates, that this king might enter in. You ever look up at the stars at night? Psalm 8 says it this way, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And then it says, when I consider the heavens, the world, and the stars which you've put in place, what is man that you're mindful of him? The Son of Man that you even care for him. Have you ever looked up and like, man, look at the vastness of the universe. I'm so small. And yet God knows my name. He knows everything about each one of us. The Bible describes God just marking out the stars with a handbreadth, calling each one by name. What size gate would you need for the God who stretched out this heaven? And yet, he wants to dwell among us. He knows each one of us by name. He knows every hair on our head. He knows our thoughts before we think them. What size gate would you need for this God? And would you agree with me that no matter what kind of thing you made, whether it's a Kleenex box or a golden calf or the most ornate idol, that would fall short of this King of glory? I want to read a Bible passage to you. This comes from Deuteronomy chapter 4. I want you to just listen. God's recalling what happened when he met his people on Sinai. This is what he says. Remember the day you stood before the Lord at Horeb, that's Sinai, when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my words so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land and may teach them to their children. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain while it blazed with fire to the very heavens with black clouds and deep darkness. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice. You saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you out of Horeb, out of the fire. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or woman, like any animal on earth or any bird that flies in the air, or like any creature that moves along the ground or any fish in the waters below. Like God's saying, when I was there, you didn't see anything. You just heard my voice. So whatever you do, don't make God into a thing. Which I'd suggest to you, when Moses was gone, they were wondering where God was. They wanted to make God present. So like, here, this will represent God. He's here among us again. But it was the wrong thing to do. Why? Because God is not like a thing. Here's what we do with things. We control them. We manipulate them. We're in charge of them. Not God. He's the King of glory, the maker of heaven and earth. We cannot treat God like this. Which, by the way, I don't think we're too different than the Israelites. Right? We want God to be present in our lives, but I'd suggest that most of us want God to be present in our lives on our terms, not his. Like, you remember the very first sin in the garden? The serpent came up to Eve and said, if you eat this, you'll be what? Like God. And we thought, that sounds good. We all want to be like God, and so our hearts swelled with pride, and we love the idea that we sit on the throne of our life. And there's this idea that just runs through Scripture. I mean, we would love to just treat God like some thing. Like, he can be present, but as long as I'm in control. I mean, even when we pray, like, okay, God, I need you to do this, I need you to, right? I mean, even though we might not make a thing, I'd suggest a lot of us, we treat God as though we're in charge and he's there to do our bidding. But God doesn't want us to think of him like that. He's not a thing. He's not an object. Lift up your heads, O ye gates. Be lifted up, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord Almighty is his name. He's not a thing. He's God. And our only response is to get down off the throne and admit, he's God. I'm just one of his creatures. He's in control. I surrender. I'm one of his servants. There's no way for God to be present until we do that. until we just acknowledge reality. The Bible says that true worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. What kind of God stretched out the heavens and created the scenes that we saw? Who was he? And I would just suggest that if you walk through these doors today and you're thinking about Emmanuel, the reason for the season, Christmas, that God would be among us, that he'd give us life so that we could be brought back into his presence, then our response is finally just one of faith and trust. To get down off the throne of our life, to acknowledge that he's God, and we are his people.